The Native Americans who once inhabited this area remain among us, although unseen. We walk in their footsteps, unaware of their presence. While we can point to no structures they left behind, traces of them remain, unacknowledged by most people. It's rare today to see someone who is full Native or nearly so in Springfield. Today, Natives are the forgotten people. Look at any groups of statistics by age, race, ethnicity, and you see white, Black, Asian, Latino, sometimes others, but rarely are Natives mentioned. This includes the statistics we see now for COVID, although Natives are one of the most strongly affected groups by COVID. As a young child growing up in Springfield, I lived on Seminole Street. I went to kindergarten a couple of blocks away on Cherokee Street. I knew those were Indian names, but nothing about the tribes they represented. We moved to a new house later, on land a segment of the Trail of Tears once crossed, and I started second grade at Kickapoo School, now Disney. I was in class with a few Native children there. While I realized they were a bit darker and Indian, I had no idea what tribes they represented or even what a tribe was. I certainly didn't connect them to the people I saw on TV westerns who rode horses, lived in teepees, shot bows and arrows, and wore feathers in their hair. These children wore clothes like everyone else, lived in regular houses, their parents drove cars. The closest they got to the Indians we saw on TV was the picture of the big chief on their tablets. There was quite a disconnect between image and reality. That year, we visited my aunt in Oklahoma for the first time. Once again, I was really excited. I thought it would look like the Old West I saw on TV. Where are the Indians? I asked my uncle in desperation as we drove down Main Street. See that man there walking down the sidewalk? He's an Indian, my Uncle Claude said. Once again, I was disappointed. The man wore a regular shirt, jeans, and shoes, and I couldn't have picked him out of a crowd. For more than a century, this country has had a love-hate relationship with its original inhabitants. We see them as a romantic part of our heritage. As school children, we learn the mythologized tales of Pocahontas rescuing Captain John Smith, of Squanto showing the pilgrims how to bury a dead fish with each hill of corn to make it grow, of the native neighbors helping the pilgrims survive that first winter. But along with the kindly welcoming native, we also were treated to images of terrifying savages scalping innocent settlers who, after all, wanted nothing more than to take their land and force them to leave the places where they had lived for as long as their tribes could remember. After all, these natives were inconveniencing progress, standing in the way of civilization and Christianity, impeding the American dream and this country's manifest destiny. Poor old Squanto might not have been so helpful. Could he have foreseen that his tribe would have been one of the first to be wiped out? Our revered founding fathers wrote of merciless Indian savages in the Declaration of Independence. And as an interesting sidelight, in these COVID-19 days, on some native websites, you can get a mask that says merciless Indian savages. On reading history, we might as well say the merciless colonial invaders. They forced natives who had lived in their culture for centuries to change to correspond to the white way of life. They were encouraged or forced to convert to Christianity. The Spanish conquistadors were especially fond of making indigenous people choose the cross or the sword, and if not, the sword would kill them. Europeans took youngsters from their families and placed them in faraway mission schools. They cut their hair, took away their traditional clothing, and trained the boys in trade and the girls in housewifely duties. They prohibited their languages. A woman told me several years ago about how her grandmother persisted in speaking her language at a boarding school. The first time she did, they forced her to sleep outside on the porch in freezing weather. She spoke her language again and they cut off one of her fingers. After losing 2 fingers, she stopped speaking her language. The motto of the famed Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, attended by Jim Thorpe, was, "Kill the Indians, save the man." There are 574 federally recognized tribes in the United States. Each tribe has its own horror story of exile and oppression. Still, other tribes cannot tell their stories because they have been exterminated. This year, during the first all-virtual General Assembly, the UUA delegates voted for member congregations to actively name and repair the harm caused by 400 years of colonization, This passed with a 94% vote. Unitarians have religious ancestry connected to the Pilgrims. This vote calls UUs to be honest about this heritage and work to repair relationships with Indigenous peoples. As a religious tradition, we cannot decide who we will be without recognizing with the truth of who some of our ancestors were, said Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, UUA president. Building a future right relationship with each other and the earth requires centering the autonomy of Indigenous people and working to actively divest from our legacies of colonialism. On this 400th anniversary of the Pilgrims coming to the United States, those of us with colonialist ancestry have work to do. The vote passed as an action of immediate witness, which allows UUs to respond quickly to urgent social issues and empowers the UUA's organizing team to take related action. It reflects an ongoing commitment to support and partner with Indigenous people and repair the harms of colonization. Earlier this year, the UUA published a statement supporting the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe after the federal government issued an order to disestablish the tribe's reservation status. The position paper describes white settler colonization and colonialism as extractive, expansive, and based on violent patriarchy, resulting in a preponderance of missing and murdered Indigenous women and creating unsustainable conditions for all living beings. It condemns this administration's continued attacks on Indigenous peoples' lands, sacred sites, and sovereignty, and calls for supporting all Indigenous people who are struggling to preserve their lands, waters, peoples, sacred lands, and sovereignty. Perhaps before we talk about ways to do this, we should examine some of the history that we weren't taught in school. We may think of the Indian Wars as something that only happened in the days of the Wild West, culminating in Custer's defeat of Little Bighorn and the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. But the process began decades before. I will talk about a few incidents involving the tribes I know best. The tribe I know best, the Cherokees, my husband's tribe and the nation in which I lived for years, and a tribe I'm just now learning about, the Aleuts. After taking a DNA test in 2017, I discovered my great-grandmother was Aleutic Alaska native from Kodiak Island, and I am 1/8 Aleut. The ouster of natives from their homelands began shortly after the Pilgrims landed, and most had been driven westward to the Appalachians by the time Jefferson and his contemporaries signed the Declaration of Independence. Just after using the term merciless Indian savages, the Declaration elaborates that the so-called savages focused on destruction of all, regardless of sex, age, or condition. But they weren't the only ones who took no notice of age, gender, or infirmity. 2 decades before he became president, and before his decree to expel natives west of the Mississippi, Andrew Jackson was a young officer in 1812 based in Tennessee. He led a variety of troops, including Cherokees and other natives, against Muskogee Creek warriors during the Red Stick Rebellion. The fighting was fierce and the conditions exhausting for people on both sides, struggling to survive in a wilderness that offered them little sustenance. Both federal and native troops almost starved. Once, some of Jackson's troops found the remains of a deer a Creek warrior had just butchered and gobbled down what was left. That October, Jackson and his troops, which included Davy Crockett, took the village of Tallushatchee by surprise. Dozens of people of all ages crowded into one house for sanctuary. The troops shot as many as they could and set the house on fire, burning the rest inside. One soldier beat to death a toddler he found alive, rationalizing the child would just grow up to be an Indian. Later at Horseshoe Bend, the Creek Red Stick warriors took refuge in a barricaded camp on a peninsula in the river. Jackson's troops surrounded them, attacking from above and from the river below, and wiped out the battle-weary Creeks. "It was dark before we finished killing them," Jackson wrote to his wife. In order not to have a highly inflated body count, Jackson ordered the noses cut off the dead people, men, women, and children, as they were counted. The bodies numbered 557 on land, with an estimated 300 dead in the river. With the Red Stick uprising quelled, Jackson continued with his political ambitions as a congressman and senator before becoming president, while at the same time working to banish all natives west of the Mississippi. Georgia settlers with an economy based on large plantations had the same objective. The natives hindered the expansion of those plantations, whether they lived in small cabins in the woods or large estates similar to those of the white planters. In fact, the Georgians found the plantations established by Cherokee leaders particularly offensive. Georgia was able to reach a settlement with the remaining Creeks, buying their land, but the Cherokees refused to leave their homeland. In 1827, the Cherokees established a constitution based on the one composed by the founding fathers of the United States. It contained a provision that selling Cherokee land would be punishable by death. Like most tribes, the Cherokees held tribal land in common, with individual members settling on the land they desired to farm or use to operate their business. Before the white settlers' invasion of their territory, they allowed some white people to live among them, intermarry with them, and conduct business among them. One person who was welcomed was Reverend Samuel Worcester, a congregational minister who lived and worked among them. He brought the first printing press to the Cherokee Nation, and with Cherokee Elias Boudinot, one of my husband's relatives, established the Cherokee Phoenix, a bilingual newspaper. The Cherokees emphasized education and literacy and considered the paper a valuable asset. The Georgians retaliated against the Cherokees' prosperity through their state government by passing laws making it almost impossible for natives to remain in that state and continue living their lives. The Cherokees were denied many rights. They were unable to testify in court. If arrested or sued, they were pretty much incapable of presenting a defense. Many white settlers spotted an attractive Cherokee farm and decided they should have it. After all, what rights did those Indians have to it? Sometimes they'd move in, take over the Cherokee family's possessions down to the children's toys, and if they were feeling generous, allow the farm's original occupants to spend some time in a shed until they could move along elsewhere. The Cherokees couldn't sue the state of Georgia because of the Georgia law, but Worcester did so on their behalf, taking the case to the Supreme Court. The court ruled in the Cherokees' favor. Chief Justice John Marshall wrote that the relationship between the Indian nations and the United States was one of nations, that the native tribes had sovereignty. State governments did not have the right to deal with the tribes, and the Georgia laws were invalid. Of course, this was not the conclusion Andrew Jackson wished. He reportedly said, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Knowing the federal government would not recognize their rights, Cherokee leaders became divided. One group vehemently opposed ceding any of their traditional land holdings. The chief assured people that if they persisted, they would prevail and they could stay where they were. The second group became equally convinced that they could not remain in Georgia and thought it better to negotiate a treaty that would at least bring them some compensation for their property and assist them in relocating to Indian Territory. After signing the treaty, many were able to travel by river west rather than walking. Those who remained were unceremoniously rounded up with the clothes on their backs and little else and crowded into stockades. They waited there for months, many perishing before beginning the march west that became known as the Trail of Tears. About 1/4 of those who made the journey, around 4,000, died along the way. Many of the dead were frail older people and children. And you can see Trail of Tears signs at various points throughout Springfield and Greene County because one of the detachments did come through here. One of my husband's relatives, Betsy Christie, died in this manner. Betsy was 38 years old. She and her husband, Lacey, already had several small children when she gave birth to her last child somewhere along the trail during the horrible winter of 1838. Weakened from childbirth, Betsy held baby in her arms until she died. Lacey took the newborn from her arms. He barely had time to bury Betsy in an unmarked grave before they were forced to move on. A relative wrote, Lacey was now both father and mother to his children, but he gave them strength and determination to continue on the unwanted journey. The oldest daughters cared for the younger children as they crossed Arkansas. After a journey of several hundred miles through 5 states, they arrived at Fort Smith on January 4th, 1839. The Cherokee families were herded into corrals like livestock. Lacey had lost not only his wife and his father, but other family members also on the trail. In the opening words, we heard how this land we live on was the former territory of the Osage Nation. The Osage, too, were forced out in the early 1800s into Indian Territory to make way for the members of the 5 tribes who Jackson wanted to move in this direction. In the late 1820s, Missouri and Arkansas also forced the natives who had stopped here to move westward into Indian Territory. Tribes along the West Coast had their contact with Europeans from different countries, but the consequences were the same. The first Europeans who encountered my Aleut ancestors were led by the Russian explorer Bering in 1741. They also sought conquest and wealth, although rather than gold, they wanted the fur of seals and other sea mammals. In 1745, the slaughter and forced servitude of Aleutic people began. There were an estimated 25,000 Aleuts at the time of first contact. And by the end of that century, only 2,500 remained. So 9 out of 10 were killed or died. Over the first century of contact, many native people were enslaved by the Russians. Most people are aware of the forced relocation of Japanese Americans into internment camps during World War II. But Aleuts also were placed in internment camps during the war, supposedly for security reasons. Many had to endure living in abandoned fish canneries that were unsuitable for human habitation, and many died. Even today, the odds don't favor native people. They are more likely to grow up in poverty, to be victims of violence, to suffer from diabetes or COVID-19. Though their numbers are smaller, native men are just as likely to be shot and killed by police as Black men. Tim's cousin, Dominic Rollis, became one of these statistics 4 years ago when he was shot and killed by Tahlequah police. Native women living on reservations often are raped by white men, and the assailants go unpunished because the native law enforcement officials lack jurisdiction over the white offenders. Now, what can we as do as individuals and as a UU congregation? Some of us have participated individually in group efforts, such as supporting the water protectors at Standing Rock during their efforts against the Dakota Access Pipeline 4 years ago. We can continue to do this and assist other efforts as these occasions arise. We can encourage laws protecting the environment, corresponding with native beliefs that the earth is sacred and should not be destroyed. In many ways, this ties in well with the things most UUs believe and already practice. We can fight against destruction of sacred native sites, such as the Bears Ears Monument in the Black Hills. We can support the efforts of Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA to bring missing women home and seek justice for the victims of violence against Native women. We can also support the efforts of the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. We can buy things from Native-owned businesses and not spend money with any pseudo-Native businesses. There are many people out there who pretend to be Native for financial purposes and perform cultural appropriation. These people should be avoided and strongly discouraged, and these are the people you're probably most likely to encounter around here. Most of all, we can participate in activities with our local Native population. All Tribes United enjoyed holding a dance here at the church before the pandemic forced our group to become less active. In the future, we look forward to working with First UU on projects to promote educational, cultural, and recreational activities for natives living in the Springfield area, along with the general population. We hope there will be many such opportunities in the future, and I'll be glad to help keep us all informed of these as they arise. Wado, which is Cherokee for thank you. And now Emily will perform the interlude.